Good morning. We're here with our new program, Conversation, with Dr. Charles Simmons. You are a man of great experience. You have multiple lives to the service of the blacks in America, in the civil societies, and most of us in the higher education. But we will want to start by introducing you to our viewers. And can you explain to us, you are a Baltimorean, you were born here. How was Baltimore when you was a young guy?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure seeing you, pleasure being with you. I was born here in Baltimore, Maryland, in 1938. My parents came to Baltimore from Gainesville, Georgia in 1936, following my grandmother who came here from Georgia as a domestic worker she sent for my father and my mother. 1938, Baltimore, like all the rest of the United States, was thoroughly segregated. And so, and in the segregated, and Baltimore is still in the South, although segregation was in the north of the United States as well. And in the segregated United States, blacks lived in one community, whites lived in one community. Blacks couldn't go into the stores owned by whites, and if we did, when we were able to go into stores like clothing stores, we couldn't try on the clothes, whether shoes or hats or anything. So black people had, we had our own economic base. We were forced to create our own businesses since we couldn't participate in white businesses. So we had an area in Baltimore called Pennsylvania Avenue that had a lot of black businesses in it. Then when the government and the state government, also being segregated, created public housing for low-income people. And you had to be below a certain income to qualify for this public projects, we called them, but it was public housing. The whites moved out of the community, and they moved, even where they created public housing, there was public housing for whites, public housing for blacks. So we moved in 1938 or 39, moved into what was called the Edgar Allan Poe public housing projects. Edgar Allan Poe was an author, white writer. And I grew up in public housing. Interestingly enough, even though you had to be below a certain income level to move in, to live, to qualify for public housing, my neighbors who lived across the street from me, who were not in public housing, lived in conditions worse than ours. In public housing, we had good cement floors, we had steam heat, and we had indoor plumbing. I'm talking about 1938, 39, 40. My neighbors right across the street, some of my neighbors across the street from me still had outdoor outhouses and lived in worse conditions than we were, even though we were poorer than them. I went to school. The schools were all segregated. Phyllis Wheatley Colored School, it was called, was my elementary school, not far away. Booker T. Washington Junior High and Frederick Douglass High School. Interestingly enough, though, in the projects where we lived, it was like community. The men in the project formed, and you had to, if you had children, you had to be married. We had seniors in the projects, but all the families with children had a husband, had a mother and a father, had to live there in order to qualify. So the men of the public housing projects would start men's club. And in the evening when they'd come home from work, they would meet and they would invite the young boys in to sit and participate. the women started women's clubs, and so they would invite the young girls in to sit and participate. So at an early age, we were exposed to that kind of organizing and developing and addressing problems and issues facing your community, even as poor kids growing up, because of the environment there. Between the courts where we lived, you would have a building going this way, a building across, and a building coming this way. And in between all the courts were basketball courts, and recreation facilities. So even though it was for poor people, we were exposed to a lot of interaction and camaraderie, both with our peers as well as with the parents of our peers. And so that developed, I believe, that kind of early interaction and early attempts to think about and address societal problems at a young age imbues in children, even poor black children, the ideas and the concept and the practice of addressing and dealing with your own problems and dealing with situations that affect you as a community and as a people and as a family. So my experience of growing up in the project, I think, was a very positive one. After high school, in fact, I left high school in the 12th grade and went into the Marine Corps. And I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps.
When did you start in the Marine Corps?
1955.
Okay.
In 1955, at 17 years of age, I went into the Marine Corps. I was at Parris Island. My basic training was at Parris Island, and advanced combat training at Camp Lejeune. I was then assigned to the Atomic Energy Commission, where I went to aeronautics school at Jacksonville, Florida, and Memphis, Tennessee. And I spent the balance of my time, we were in a helicopter unit assigned to the Atomic Energy Commission, where they experienced with the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb. And so what we would do as...
we will reach that stage. I want to come back a little bit about
Okay.
these men's clubs.
Okay.
How was it organized? Can you give us a concrete example of how it was working?
Well, for example, we would talk about work. If someone was out of work or lost their job, the men would convene the meeting, and they would invite the boys in to observe. On occasion, I mean, we were free to participate if we had something to add, but for the most part, we were observers, and so they would address a range of issues in the community, whether it was jobs, whether it was economic development, how one could start their own business if we would, for example, if a person had lost their job and wanted to start a business, these men would explore ways to help raise money to get started, find a location, things like that. Long ago, we would have sometimes issues with police brutality, and so the men would address that issue. What can we do? How can we contact the mayor or the governor or the regional police department to raise these kind of issues? So it was a range of issues that affected our community that these men would, the men in our community, the fathers in our community would address. The women would do the same thing. Issues of helping young girls to understand womanhood, some of the problems they faced maturing, growing up, female problems and things like that. So they addressed a range of issues that affected young people, both young boys and young girls. And so we were able to learn and primarily get the experience and exposure of people addressing the issues affecting their community that is not available in every impoverished community, whether it's black or white. So in a way, it was very helpful for us to grow up in that kind of environment.
In a typical meeting, how many men were there and how many children around?
I would think 10 to 15 men and 8 to 10 children. You know, it was in an assembly hall.
Yes.
You know, there were facilities, design, recreation facilities, meeting facilities, all built into the infrastructure of the public housing.
How often did you meet?
Once a week.
Once a week.
Men would meet once a week.
When did it end, the experience of this meeting?
Well,
and why?
Now we're talking about, I was, again, beginning and we're talking about 1939. And I would say that continued. I went into the Marine Corps in 1955, and I was still living in the public housing from 1939 to 1955. I would think that these clubs survived from 39 to 49 or 50, at least. And there were other activities. You know, there were athletic clubs playing basketball, and we had basketball courts in between the public housing units. Mm-hmm. And so we had organized basketball, kids playing basketball. Some of the older children in the community, both who lived in public housing and who are our neighbors right outside of public housing, started football teams called the Mystics, 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 and they organized the young kids called the Junior Mystics. So we had organized football in the community, and I played football. So it was a lot of interaction with each other and with our peers and with our seniors that occurred during that time.
Thank you. Now you are in the Marines, and I interrupted you.
1955,
yes.
I went into the Marine Corps, and my basic training was at Parris Island, South Carolina, and Camp Lejeune, advanced combat training, advanced at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. And then I was assigned to the Atomic Air. I went in the Marine Air Command, and we were in a helicopter unit assigned to the Atomic Energy Commission. And our role, what happened was, the United States was experimenting with the atomic bomb. And so in Nevada, Yucca Flats, Nevada, and other areas right outside of Yucca Flats, Nevada, they would explode an atomic bomb, either in the air or on ground level or underground. And our response, and they would put these sensors out to test the radiation, the amount of radiation from these atomic bombs. And they would place the sensors, and our responsibility after the blast, and they would have Marines and sailors and soldiers in foxholes and out in the public exposed to this radiation, and after the explosion, we would have to go out and retrieve the sensors that would measure the level of radiation. But also, we, along with the soldiers and Marines who were in foxholes and out in the public, were exposed to the radiation. And we would have to wear these badges that would measure the level of radiation exposure. So that was for the atomic bomb. Then later, several years later, when the United States started experimenting with the hydrogen bomb in Anahuac, the Marshall Islands, I was sent there, again with the Atomic Energy Commission. Again, they'd explode the bomb. We'd have to go out and retrieve the sensors that measured the level of radiation. Again, we wear these badges, and Marines and soldiers and sailors were exposed to the level of radiation. And many, if not most of us, developed cancer as a outcome of the exposure to the radiation. But that occurred, down the years later. We didn't know. I mean, those of us who were exposed to it didn't know. I'm sure that the people who were in charge knew what was, knew the effects of radiation on the human body. But not only were sailors, soldiers, and Marines exposed to radiations, when they started the testing of the hydrogen bomb, and they did the same thing for the atomic bomb, people in the immediate area, the residents in the immediate area, were moved out. And when they came back after all this testing, atomic and hydrogen testing occurred, the environment was contaminated. The water was contaminated, the food, everything that grew was contaminated. So these areas were unable to, uninhabitable later. And even the people who came in years later to clean up the effects of the radiation were exposed to it and became ill from cancer and other what they call presumptive diseases that the federal government is now paying people who were exposed to some of these and who contracted many of these presumptive diseases. Cancer was just one of them, but there were several other diseases that affects the human body from exposure to radiation.
Yes, we are just here at the beginning of these experiments, either an atomic bomb in Nevada or in Marshall Island, regarding the hydrogen. And you're going yourself, you're being exposed to all these radiations. How did it affect you then and after your services in the years later?
Well, as a young person then, I was not aware of the possible side effects of the radiation. And I didn't start experiencing the physical effects until later on. But I ended up with esophageal cancer. I was treated at the Cancer Treatment Centers of America for esophageal cancer. And I guess cured. So I was one of the lucky ones, because most of us don't survive cancer.
Yes, exposing people like this, was it a question of ignorance by your superiors? Did they know the danger you were going through, or was it that you are a soldier, you have to face the danger?
I have to think that the superiors knew, and the people who control, knew. The soldiers and the sailors who were exposed to it didn't know, but the superiors knew, I'm almost sure.
And did you have any appraisal of whether they were sending more blacks or whites, or this was indifferent?
When I was there were both blacks and whites there. Even in my company. Remember now, in the early days, in those days, the Marine Corps was the last branch of service that integrated. In the past, all of the services were segregated. There were blacks in the service, but they were in separate divisions, separate companies, up until integration. But even after integration, in my platoon, in my division, there were more whites than blacks. So, in fact, when I went in 1955, my basic training platoon, there were only about 5 blacks in that platoon. So I don't know. I'm not aware that they were sending more blacks to be experimented on than whites. But I know there were both.
When you discovered this cancer yourself, was it easier for you to get the Marine Corps admitted that you had it while you were in service?
It was easy. By that time, there were others who had thousands of service people had already started complaining and getting benefits from these diseases. And so that the government set up a whole list of these diseases that they call presumptive diseases, from exposure to radiation to contaminated water. In Camp Lejeune, for example, the water was contaminated. There were companies there that would put their waste in the regular water, and the water was contaminated. So many of the Marines, if not most of the Marines who were stationed at Camp Lejeune, and this went on for over 15 years, and I believe that they knew the water was contaminated. But later, when people started complaining and started suing and started bringing litigation against the government, they set up a system where they acknowledged that the exposure to contaminated water, the exposure to radiation, the exposure to other things created illnesses that they call presumptive diseases. So if you fell in those categories of one of these presumptive diseases, you were almost automatically given benefits, disability benefits.
And when did you end your service in the Marine?
1959, 1960. I came back. I was stationed in California. My base, the helicopter base, was in Santa Ana, California, right outside of Los Angeles. So when I was separated from the Marine Corps, I knew a lot of people who lived there. So I stayed there for a year or more, lived there, started working there. My brother was also in the Marine Corps. He was stationed in El Toro, California. He was a ordnance man, and they created and attached ordnance to jets, missiles and things like that. So he was about 3 miles from me. And so he stayed in for 20 years. I got out after 4 years. But I stayed there and interacted with him, and I had a child there. My oldest son, Dominic, was born there, and so I stayed there. I didn't come back home until way after 1960, and I moved back and forth, went back and forth from Los Angeles to Baltimore. So I came back here late 1960, 1961, 1962, came back to Baltimore.
Yes, reflecting back as a young Marines, young black Marines, what have you learned during your years in Marines for yourself, for the U.S. society at that time?
Well, I would say that one of the benefits of military life, and especially the Marine life, is the development of the discipline, self-disciplines. And I think that helped me in my later years, that I could focus on something like the work I did with developing the college, and before that, years ago in the Teamsters Union and things like that. So I think one of the good things that come out of that is the sense or the development of discipline. Because when you're in the Marine Corps and in the service, that's what you do every day. You're training and you're studying and you're running and so everything is focus and discipline and timing and so that instills in one a sense of purpose, a sense of discipline. Also, the school, I went to aeronautic school. The physical training is beneficial for you. The interaction with other people of other cultures, other cities, other states, other parts of the world. I traveled in different places when I was there. So that exposure. But also, there are many negative aspects of that as well, because again, it was segregated. For example, when I was in boot camp, this is when you first go in, there were only about 5 or 6 or 7 black guys, black men. And give you an example, one day, a young man, there were only 2 of us from Baltimore that were there, and his name was Robert Jones, and so we became friends. I'm a 17-year-old kid now. We became friends, and so one day we were standing talking to each other, and so were all the white recruits, over there, white boys standing talking to each other, some over there, some over there. So the drill instructor, who's head of all, of the boot camp of that platoon, came to us and said, "Break it up. Y'all remind me of the Gold Dust Twins." Now, back in those days, there was a product. It was in a package. It was in a box. The box was gold, and on the face of this box were black images with beady hair, big lips, big ears, big eyes, black, on a gold box, and they called it the Gold Dust Twins. It was very humiliating. And America has a lot of that. You may know that even today, since the demonstrations that's going on around the country, there was a pancake mix called Auntie Mama that has a black woman on it with a rag tied around her head. Aunt, A-U-N-T, but they call her Aunt Jemima, Jemami or Jemama, Mama. Very negative, stereotypical image of a black person that this company, I think it's Procter & Gamble, is just right now, as we speak, talking about changing that package. But back in that day, there were a number of those products like that. And this it was baking soda. This baking soda called the Gold Dust Twins had this very negative image of black people with big lips and buck eyes and beady hair, and and so he would come up to us, and he felt comfortable come up to us and break it up, with all the white boys still standing around talking to each other, and tell us to break it up because we reminded him of the Gold Dust Twins. In advanced training in Camp Lejeune, the drill instructor looked around. We were all sitting on the ground, and a few blacks in the platoon. He looked around and he said to one of the blacks, "What's your name?" "Yes, sir, my name is," whatever his name was. He said, "From now on, your name is Midnight." And then he looked around and he found the one who was a little darker than him, and you were half past midnight. And so that was the sense, that was the environment back in 1955, that these people felt free and comfortable enough, treating us and talking to black people like that. I mean, that's what segregation was in the United States. When I went to Jacksonville, Florida, now Jacksonville was the northernmost city of Florida, highly segregated. We would go into town, the Marines on the weekend would go into town. We were in an advanced aeronautics school. We'd go into town into Jacksonville on the weekend, and these gangs of white people would jump on if they caught you by yourself, in a club or a restaurant or in a bar. They'd beat you, jump on you, and so many, beat you with chains and tire irons, and sent many black people to the hospital. Many black Marines would come back to the base in an ambulance to the hospital. And it went on until one day we decided that we were going to have what we called the dungaree party. So the Marines got together, organized with black and white Marines, got together, put on our dungarees, our fatigues, and went in town and went into some of the areas where the Marines were beaten, and we'd, get revenge, seek revenge. And that's what stopped that beating of Marines on the weekend. And that's what it took to stop it, when we would go back in and retaliate. So in those days, my experience was both good and bad, and both positive and negative. But it develops in you, a sense of purpose, a sense of pride, and a sense of meaning that, you have to do something for yourself and for your people.
How did you react when this superior came, pointed the figure at you while other whites were there, and this other black guy who was called Midnight and the other one after Midnight? Mm-hmm. I think they were your superior, and you are in the army, you have to obey. But did you have any reaction, or did you have any possibility, or did you just have to obey?
Basically, there's nothing that you can do in a situation like that. So what it does, you hate it, you feel it, you're angry, but you have to decide whether you're going to learn how to take this and dress it and deal with it, internalize it, or you're going to act out and end up either incarcerated in jail, in the brig is what we called it in the service, or dishonorably discharged. Now there were individuals during my training who did act out and who were either placed in jail or dishonorably discharged. But what it does, if you can manage to contain and that energy and that anger, you do so. But what it does, it also develops in you a sense of purpose, that this is something that I need to address, and I need to fight, and I need to change. And so in many ways, I think it contributed to my determination to be a change agent.
Okay, thank you. One last question about your Marine years. You thought that you had aeronautical courses. I want to know, what did you learn in this regard?
Aeronautical?
Yes.
We were in a helicopter squadron, and so it helps you understand, the discipline of air, of flight, and helicopter mechanics,
Yes.
a lot of the things that you need to do to keep a helicopter in the air.
Okay.
Here
you are coming back to Baltimore. Did you notice any change in the city? How was your reaction coming back home?
When I came back, my parents were still living in the projects. So, and it was still generally segregated. So we're talking about now late 60s.
Yes.
We had 1964, there was a civil rights decision, and so we were pretty much during the 60s. And even after civil rights decision, it didn't change anything right away. So it was still a lot of segregation. Although things were beginning to open up, we could, for example, go into the main stores downtown. But we couldn't try on. We had to go to a certain section of the stores, either the basement, and we couldn't try on. When they were allowed us to try on shoes or hats, we had to put on a stocking cap or a new set of socks or something like that. So it was still a lot of segregation, but the black community, business community was growing. We had our own black hospital, Provident Hospital, here in Baltimore. We had a number of black businesses up and down Pennsylvania Avenue and around the city. But later, it began to open up some integration. But the problem with that is, once, at least in my mind and my experience and my understanding of what happened, the negative aspects of integration was that once the white stores opened and we were allowed to go to the white stores, we went to the white stores, and as opposed to continuing to go to the black stores, and the black-owned stores ended up going out of business because we started patronizing the white stores. And so that whole black community, that whole black business community that we had then is gone. Gone.
You mean that integration, so to speak, has somehow contributed to kill the black business?
In my mind, that's what happened. We would walk past, not me, but
Yes.
but black folks would walk past. Now that we can go into the white store, we could go walk past the black store and patronize the white store. Now, the white store was bigger, had more, products because they had more money. They were, they controlled everything. But we still, the black movies went out of business. Eventually, Providence Hospital closed. We had around the country, from my understanding, had around 15 black hospitals in different cities throughout this nation. I don't know if we have any now. Providence was here in Baltimore. That's gone. We had Park Sausage, which was a black sausage manufacturing company, huge black company, gone. We had bars and restaurants, gone. Movie theaters, gone. Clothing stores, gone.
Dr. Simmons, this is quite strange. This did not happen on one day. This is a progressive thing going on, and you see it happening. How did the black community, how were they organized? Didn't they do anything to fight back?
There were groups that tried to organize, but it's a strange thing. The mentality of black people who had been so oppressed for so long, finally when you lift a foot off of your head, and you allow you to move around, and you want to feel privileged and go and participate in the white stores. It was hard to reverse that mentality during those days.
Was there nobody to organize, to see the mistake in terms of business, the harm?
There were groups that organized, yeah. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. There were other, Urban League. There were other organizations that organized that tried to reverse this process that are still around. NAACP is still here. Urban League is still here. There are other black organizations. Other black organizations evolved out of the community, the Black Panthers, later on in life. It was difficult to reverse that move, that process. The Black Panthers, even later in years, organized, and the Muslim organization, and they were successful. The Muslims, under the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, they started their own businesses, and they were very successful. They had a number of black businesses. The Black Panthers organized. They even organized and started feeding programs in the community. There were number of other groups that did that. They were feeding, because we were still poor. And they were starting feeding programs and educational and training programs and sports and social organizations in the community. The Black Panthers even went so far as later on in years of arming themselves as a protective force, a police force in the community. But the white community responded by killing them off, assassinating them, breaking into their house in the middle of the night, killing them, locking them up, forcing them. That was before they passed this gun legislation that legalized the carrying of guns. You see now, during some of these demonstrations now, that some of these right-wing white groups are going on with these automatic weapons, and going out to these demonstrations and black demonstrations with these automatic weapons, and it's fine, their president called them very fine people. But when blacks did that, they were assassinated and killed. Police killed them, arrested them.
Here you are in the Baltimore at the end of the 60s. What is your project? What are you looking for?
Well, I became involved with the labor movement. And that was quite by accident. I worked at a big company called Montgomery Ward. I worked in the shipping and receiving department. I ended up making more money than the supervisor, white supervisor, and so he became a little angry, and he wanted me to stop working overtime. And I said, well, I'm not working in your department. I'm working in another department overtime. You don't have any control over that. So he fired me. And we were represented by the Teamsters Union. And so I went to the union to file a grievance against the company. Mm-hmm. And so being a black person, and I guess the way I presented myself, and they hired me as a Teamsters Union representative and organizer, because in those days, I remember now, we're just coming out of segregation, out of integration and segregation, out of segregation to integration, and the Teamsters wanted to recruit more black people. Mm-hmm. And so there were all these companies that hired these black people, so they needed a black organizer. So they hired me, and I became a very successful black union organizer. And because of the tenor of the environment in those days, we still had civil rights movements going on. And as I mentioned, we had the Black Panthers that emerged out of the community. We had a lot of civil rights activities in organizations like NAACP Urban League. In Baltimore, there was a gentleman named Walter P. Carter. He was a black Jesuit. He was a member of the Jesuit Society, and but he was an activist, and he would bring a lot of these white ministers, white Jesuits, and help organize different communities, black communities. So, and they would put picket lines around these companies when he was trying to get a movement going to organize around integrating a particular venue. And so when I needed help organizing some of these companies that had all these black workers that they were oppressing, I would ask Walter Carter to get some pickets, some people to bring in and come put pickets around this company. Mm-hmm. And so he would. And so that would help me organize. So I became a very effective organizer. And on the same token, when he wanted to organize a demonstration around a civil rights activity, mm-hmm. integrating a grocery store or a lunch counter, which is what he did, mm-hmm. He would get me to come. I was a good organizer, to come organize. So I would organize African Americans to come join him to help put pickets around to integrate different businesses or different, activities, mostly lunch counters. They were doing in those days, a lot of demonstrations around lunch counters, and a lot of, the police would bring the fire department and the hose police out and put these big heavy hoses that would knock you out on the picket line. These hoses were power enough to flip you. You could, knock you on the ground. But black people just continued to challenge that kind of violence and oppression, and just continue. They would get beat. Police would beat, come up with horses and trucks and cars and run into people on the picket line and beat them, and arrest them. And blacks just continued to fight and continued to demonstrate until they got what they went after.